At its height, it ruled a quarter of humanity. A flag on every horizon. 13 million square miles of red, from the frozen north to the burning sands of Africa. It built railways through deserts, carved trade routes across oceans, and pulled tea from mountains it had no right to climb. But empires built on ambition and arrogance don't last forever. The British Empire rose on sails and steam, and fell to fire and freedom. This is the story of how the empire on which the sun never set finally sank beneath the waves. This is the British Empire, from ships to ashes.
Let's start with the truth. Britain wasn't destined for greatness. In 1490, it was a cold, wet island on the edge of Europe. Irrelevant, poor, divided. Spain owned the seas. Portugal controlled the trade routes. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. England, it was a nobody. But then, everything changed. A Venetian navigator named John Cabot sails west under the English flag. He's looking for a shortcut to Asia. Instead, he finds Newfoundland. It's freezing, it's barren, there's no gold. But Cabot plants a flag anyway. And just like that, England enters the game. For the next 100 years, they watch from the sidelines as Spain gets fantastically rich off the Americas. They see Portugal dominate the spice trade. And they're hungry. They want a piece of the action. Enter Queen Elizabeth I. She can't afford a proper navy. She definitely can't compete with Spain's mighty armada. So she does something utterly genius and ruthless. She turns pirates into national heroes. Men like Francis Drake. They were called privateers, basically legal thieves with a royal blessing. Drake sails around the world, raiding Spanish ships, stealing their gold, and burning their ports. To Spain, he was a monster, a terrorist. But to Elizabeth, she called him Sir Francis. By 1588, Spain has had enough. They send the greatest naval force ever assembled to invade England. 130 ships, 30,000 men, the Spanish Armada. On paper, England stood no chance. They had smaller ships, fewer men, and were hopelessly outgunned. Except, they weren't. The English used a clever and terrifying tactic: fire ships. They set their own empty vessels ablaze and sent them drifting into the Spanish fleet at night. Panic spread like wildfire. The Armada scattered. Then a massive storm, what the English called the Protestant wind, finished the job. Half the Spanish ships never made it home. And Britain? Britain just became a naval power. This victory changed everything. A new confidence surged through the nation. Elizabeth grants a charter to a group of London merchants, the East India Company. It doesn't sound very threatening, does it? It just sounds like a business. But this company would go on to conquer more land than most kings ever dreamed of. They start small, with trading posts in India, dealing in spices, silk, and the soon-to-be famous tea. But within a century, the company had its own army, its own navy. It even made its own laws. It wasn't just doing business in India anymore. For all intents and purposes, it was the government in many parts of India. And back home, the British state was watching, learning, and growing stronger. This was just the beginning of a story that would reshape the entire world. This history is incredibly complex, and we're just scratching the surface about how Britain really became a global power. We often hear stories of glorious exploration and clever trade, but that's not the whole picture. A huge part of the story, a part we can't ignore, is built on something much darker. It's called the Triangle of Blood, the transatlantic slave trade. British ships, loaded with guns, textiles, and alcohol, would sail to West Africa. There, these goods were traded for human lives. Millions of African men, women, and children were captured, chained, and packed into the suffocating holds of ships. The journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, was a nightmare. Disease, starvation, and despair were rampant. Hundreds died on every single voyage. Those who survived were sold in the Caribbean and the Americas as property. They were forced into brutal labor on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations, generating immense wealth for their enslavers. The ships then returned to Britain, filled to the brim with sugar, rum, and profits. This wasn't a minor part of the economy. This was the engine. Cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow were largely built on this blood money. British ships alone transported over 3 million enslaved Africans. Let that number really sink in for a moment. This is a foundational part of the story. Now, let's fast forward a bit. The year is 1756. Britain goes to war with its age-old rival, France. History calls it the 7 Years' War, but in reality, it was the first truly global conflict. The fighting raged across Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean, and Britain won, decisively. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, the map of the world had changed. Britain took Canada from France. It took Florida from Spain. It cemented its dominance in India. The British Empire wasn't just a collection of trading posts anymore. It had become a global superpower. It seemed unstoppable. But even the mightiest empires can face unexpected challenges. Along the American coast, Britain had 13 colonies. They were loyal, they were growing, and most importantly, they were profitable. But the 7 Years' War was expensive. To pay off its massive debts, Britain decided to raise taxes on the American colonists. Things like tea, stamps, paper, it all got taxed. The colonists' response? No taxation without representation. They argued they had no voice in the British Parliament, so it had no right to tax them. Tensions escalated. Britain sent soldiers to enforce its laws. The colonists, from farmers to merchants, began to organize and arm themselves. Then came the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. For 8 long, brutal years, a ragtag army of rebels fought against the most powerful military machine on the planet, and against all odds, in 1783, they won. America was born. Britain had lost its prized possession. It was a humiliating blow. But here's the twist. This loss forced Britain to pivot, to look for opportunities elsewhere, and what it found would dwarf anything it had lost in America. Enter India. For over a century, the powerful British East India Company had been expanding its influence across the subcontinent, acting almost like a state within a state. But in 1857, everything exploded. Indian soldiers known as sepoys, who were serving in the company's army, rose up in rebellion. The Indian Rebellion was incredibly violent and widespread. Cities were besieged, villages were burned, and atrocities were committed on both sides. Ultimately, the British, with their superior military organization, crushed the uprising. The aftermath was profound. The British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. It was no longer a corporate territory. It was now the centerpiece of the British Empire, the jewel in the crown. And in time, Queen Victoria would be officially named Empress of India, symbolizing this new reality. With India secured, the imperial ambition didn't stop. The late 19th century saw a new frenzy, the scramble for Africa. In 1884, the major European powers met in Berlin. With maps spread out on tables, they literally drew lines across the continent, carving it up for themselves. Not a single African leader was invited to the conference. Britain was a major player in this carve-up. It seized control of Egypt to protect the vital Suez Canal. It conquered Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria. In the south, the ambition of men like Cecil Rhodes led to the establishment of Rhodesia and control over South Africa. Rhodes dreamed of a British railway running the entire length of the continent, from Cairo to Cape Town, all of it painted red on the map. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain controlled over a quarter of the world's land and population. It had become a common saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because no matter the time of day, some part of it was always bathed in sunlight. This was the peak, an empire of unprecedented scale built through trade, war, conquest, and the exploitation of millions. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Imagine an empire so vast, the sun never sets on it. An empire built on trade, conquest, and the promise of civilization. But what happens when the sun finally begins to set? This is the story of the fall of the British Empire. Our story begins in South Africa, 1899. Britain, the undisputed global superpower, goes to war with a small group of Dutch settlers called the Boers. They're fighting over gold, diamonds, and control of the land. On paper, it should be an easy win for Britain, but it isn't. The Boers are tough, they know the terrain, and they use guerrilla tactics that frustrate the mighty British army. Frustrated and desperate, Britain does something that will forever stain its reputation. They create a new tool of war, the concentration camp. They round up Boer families, mostly women and children, and force them into these camps to break the spirit of the Boer fighters. The conditions are horrific. Disease and starvation are rampant. In the end, 28,000 civilians die in these camps, the vast majority of them children. Britain eventually wins the war, but at a terrible moral cost. The world has seen a darker side to the empire, and the cracks are beginning to show. Just over a decade later, Europe descends into the madness of World War I. Britain calls upon its vast empire for help. From the fields of India, the plains of Africa, the shores of Australia and Canada, millions answer the call. Over 1 million Indian soldiers alone serve in the British Army, fighting and dying in muddy trenches in places like Gallipoli and the Somme. Battles for a king they've never met, in a war they didn't start. They prove their courage and loyalty beyond any doubt. Britain and its allies emerge victorious, but the empire is exhausted and deeply in debt. And a powerful question begins to echo across the colonies. If we are good enough to die for the empire, why aren't we good enough to rule ourselves? The loyalty that held the empire together is starting to fray. The answer to that question comes in Amritsar, India, in 1919. A large, peaceful crowd gathers in a walled garden to protest British rule. A British officer, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, arrives with his troops. Without warning, he orders them to open fire on the unarmed men, women, and children. The crowd is trapped. There's no escape. For 10 agonizing minutes, the soldiers fire until their ammunition is nearly gone. At least 379 people are killed, and over 1,000 are wounded. Back in Britain, some celebrate Dyer as a hero who saved the empire. But in India, the Amritsar massacre is a point of no return. It exposes the brutal reality behind the veil of civilized rule. The incident galvanizes the independence movement. A quiet lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi begins to organize a nationwide campaign of nonviolent resistance. The foundation of the empire is cracking under the moral weight of its own actions. Then, in 1939, the world is plunged into war again. World War II is even more devastating. After France falls, Britain stands almost alone against the Nazi war machine. London is bombed relentlessly during the Blitz. Once again, the empire rallies. Soldiers, resources, and money pour in from the colonies to support the war effort. But this war is different. Britain may have the heart of a lion, but it's bleeding out. The new global superpowers are the United States and the Soviet Union. When the war finally ends in 1945, Britain is on the winning side, but it's a shadow of its former self. The country is bankrupt, its cities are in ruins, and its people are exhausted. The empire is no longer sustainable. The demand for independence, which had been a whisper, has become a roar that can no longer be ignored. The age of empire is over. The sun had finally set. The story of the British Empire's decline is a powerful reminder that no power lasts forever, and that the desire for freedom is one of the most powerful forces in human history. Picture this, 1947. The British Empire, the largest in history, is at its breaking point. India, the jewel in the crown, finally gains its independence, But this isn't a story of a peaceful handover. It's a story of partition, a brutal division into India and Pakistan that rips families and communities apart. Over 1 million people are killed in the ensuing violence. Millions more become refugees, fleeing across newly drawn borders in a desperate search for safety. And Britain? They just pack up and leave, leaving behind a subcontinent engulfed in flames. This was the first domino to fall. Over the next 2 decades, the call for freedom echoes across the globe. Ghana, Malaysia, Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago. One by one, the colonies demand their sovereignty, and one by one, a weakened Britain lets them go. Sometimes it was a peaceful transition, a handshake, and a lowering of the flag. But often it was a violent struggle, marked by rebellion, suppression, and bloodshed. The empire that once boasted the sun never set on it was now shrinking under the harsh light of a new dawn. Then came the ultimate humiliation, the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Egypt nationalized the vital Suez Canal, Britain, along with France and Israel, decided to take it back by force. They invaded, but the world had changed. The new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were not having it. The US applied immense financial pressure, and the Soviets threatened nuclear war. Britain was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. The message couldn't have been clearer. Britain was no longer a global superpower calling the shots. It was now a secondary player on a stage dominated by others. By the 1960s, the once mighty empire was just a shadow of its former self. A few scattered islands and territories remained. The final, symbolic act came in 1997. In a grand ceremony, Britain handed Hong Kong, its last major colony, back to China. After centuries of global dominance, the sun had finally, officially, set on the British Empire. The era was over. So, what is the legacy of this colossal empire? It's a complex and deeply contested question. On one hand, you have the spread of the English language, now spoken by billions. You have systems of parliamentary democracy, legal frameworks, and infrastructure like railways that still form the backbone of many nations today. But there's a much darker side to this inheritance. We see borders drawn on maps in London, with no regard for the ethnic, cultural, or historical realities on the ground, planting the seeds for conflicts that still rage today. We see a legacy of economic exploitation, of vast wealth and resources extracted from colonies to enrich Britain. And we see the human cost, the lives lost, cultures suppressed, and societies shattered. The British Empire didn't just rule the world, it fundamentally reshaped it, for better and, undeniably, for worse. The world we live in today is, in many ways, a direct product of this complex and often brutal history. Thank you so much for watching. This is a huge and sensitive topic, and we've only scratched the surface. What are your thoughts on the empire's legacy? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into history.